Have you ever stopped and asked yourself one of the most uncomfortable questions in the entire Bible? Moses wrote the book of Genesis, but Moses was not there when the heavens and the earth were created. He was not standing in the darkness when God said, "Let there be light." He did not walk through the Garden of Eden with Adam. He did not hear the serpent whisper to Eve. He did not watch Cain lift his hand against Abel. He was not alive when the flood waters rose over the mountains, when Noah sealed the door of the ark, or when the first rainbow appeared in the sky. Moses was born thousands of years later, in Egypt, in a time when his people were slaves under Pharaoh's hand. And yet, Genesis speaks with astonishing confidence about events no human writer could have personally witnessed. It tells us how the world began. It tells us where humanity came from. It gives us name, place, conversation, emotions, genealogies, betrayals, covenants, promises, and judgments. It tells us about Adam and Eve in the garden, Noah in the ark, Abraham beneath the stars, Jacob wrestling in the night, and Joseph weeping in secret when he saw his brother Benjamin again. So the question is not small. It is not just a question for scholars, critics, or theologians. It is a question that touches the foundation of faith itself. How did Moses write what no man witnessed? If he was not there, where did the information come from? Was it passed down through generations like sacred memory? Was it preserved in ancient records older than Egypt itself? Or did God reveal to Moses what no human eye had ever seen? This is where the mystery begins. Critics of the Bible have used this question for centuries, as if it were a weapon meant to break confidence in Scripture. They say, how could Moses know? How could he describe creation? How could he write about private conversations between God and Abraham? How could he know what happened before his own birth? And at first, the question sounds powerful. It sounds impossible. But sometimes, the questions that look like they will destroy faith are the very questions that reveal how deep the Bible really is. Because Genesis is not written like a random myth. It is not vague. It is not careless. It gives details that feel remembered, preserved, and revealed. It gives the dimensions of Noah's Ark. It names rivers and land. It follows family lines with precision. It records moments of shame, fear, jealousy, love, and grief with a kind of honesty ancient legends often avoid. And that leaves us with only a few possibilities. Either Genesis is a late invention, built from imagination, or it is something far more powerful, a sacred record formed through divine revelation, ancient memory, and the providence of God. In this video, we are going to follow that mystery step by step. We will look at the 3 strongest answers to how Moses could have written Genesis. We will look at the role of oral tradition, the possibility of ancient records, the meaning of Hebrew phrases hidden inside the structure of Genesis, and the unique relationship Moses had with God. But before we can answer the mystery, we have to feel its weight. Moses was not at creation. Moses did not see Eden. Moses did not stand beside Noah. Moses did not sit under the stars when God promised Abraham descendants as countless as the heavens. And yet, somehow, Moses gave the world the book that explains the beginning of everything. So stay with me, because the answer is not as simple as most people think. It may change the way you read Genesis forever. Now, before we even try to answer how Moses wrote Genesis, we have to understand why this question is so difficult in the first place. Because Genesis is not a small book. It is not a short legend told in a few poetic lines. Genesis is massive in scope. It begins before time, before nations, before kings, before temples, before Israel even existed as a people. It begins with God creating the heavens and the earth, and it ends with Joseph's body in a coffin in Egypt. waiting for a promise that would not be fulfilled until generations later. In between those 2 points, Genesis covers creation, the fall of man, the first murder, the rise of human violence, the flood, the scattering of nations, the call of Abraham, the birth of Isaac, the struggle of Jacob, and the painful journey of Joseph from betrayal to power. And yet, what makes Genesis so mysterious is not only the amount of time it covers, it is the level of detail it gives. Genesis does not simply say, "There was a flood." It gives the shape and size of Noah's ark. It tells us it was 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, and 30 cubits high. It does not simply say, "There was a garden." It names rivers connected to Eden. It speaks of the Pishon, the Gihon, the Tigris, and the Euphrates. It mentions lands, gold, bdellium, and onyx. These are not the kinds of details a careless storyteller adds for no reason. They make the story feel rooted in geography, memory, and ancient knowledge. And then Genesis goes even deeper. It records private conversations no ordinary historian could have overheard. It tells us what God said to Adam after the fall. It tells us what Cain said to Abel before blood was spilled. It tells us what God said to Noah before the flood. It tells us how Abraham pleaded with God for the people of Sodom, bargaining step by step, asking if God would spare the city for 50 righteous people, then 45, then 40, then 30, then 20, then 10. Who was there to write that down? Who heard Abraham's trembling voice under the trees of Mamre? Who remembered the patience of God in that moment? Genesis also enters the inner world of its characters. It tells us about Sarah laughing in disbelief. It tells us about Rachel's pain because she could not have children. It tells us about Jacob loving Joseph more than his other son. It tells us about the jealousy that burned in Joseph's brothers until they sold him as a slave. It tells us that Joseph wept when he saw Benjamin, and that he had to leave the room because his emotions overwhelmed him. These are not just historical notes. These are human details. They are the kinds of details that make us feel as if someone remembered the tears, the silence, the shame, the fear, and the hope of these people. And that brings us right back to the mystery. How did Moses know any of this? How did he know what happened in Eden when Eden was closed before he was born? How did he know the shape of the ark when the flood belonged to a world long gone? How did he know the promises spoken to Abraham centuries before Israel walked out of Egypt? Some people assume the answer must be simple. Moses invented it, or later writers invented it in his name. But that explanation creates another problem. Why would an invention include so much pain, failure, weakness, and embarrassment? Genesis does not flatter its heroes. Noah gets drunk. Abraham fears for his life. Sarah laughs at God's promise. Jacob deceives his father. Judah fails morally. Joseph's brothers become violent and cruel. If Genesis were propaganda, it is strange propaganda, because it shows the chosen family as deeply broken people who survive only because God remains faithful. That honesty matters. Ancient myths often tried to glorify kings, empires, and heroes. Genesis does something different. It reveals the truth about humanity, created by God, damaged by sin, unable to save itself, yet still pursued by divine mercy. That is why this book cannot be dismissed lightly. It is too structured to be random, too honest to be simple legend, too spiritually powerful to be treated as ordinary folklore. So, when we ask how Moses wrote Genesis, we are not just asking where he got information. We are asking what kind of book Genesis really is. Is it myth, memory, revelation, history, or all of these woven together by the hand of God? And once you feel the weight of that question, the possible answers become far more powerful. Because if Genesis contains details Moses could not naturally know, then one of three things must be true. The information was revealed from above, preserved from the beginning, or carried through ancient records until the right man was prepared to write it down. And the first answer begins with the most extraordinary relationship any prophet ever had with God. The first plausible applies the one that Jewish and Christian tradition has held for thousands of years. God revealed the beginning to Moses. And before someone dismisses that as too simple, too religious, or too easy, we need to understand what the Bible actually says about Moses. Moses was not presented as an ordinary prophet. He was not simply a moral teacher, a tribal leader, or a man with strong spiritual feelings. Scripture describes Moses as someone who stood in a category almost by himself. In Numbers chapter 12, God makes a distinction between Moses and other prophets. He says that when there is a prophet, the Lord may speak through visions or dreams. But then God says, "Not so with my servant Moses." With Moses, God says he speaks clearly, directly, face to face, not in riddles. That statement matters. It means Moses had a kind of access to divine truth that other people did not have. He did not merely guess. He did not collect vague impressions. He heard from God in a direct and personal way. Exodus says the Lord spoke to Moses as a man speaks to his friend. Now think about what that means for Genesis. If the creator of the universe speaks directly to Moses, then Moses does not need to be present at creation in order to know what happened there. The one who was present could tell him. The one who said, "Let there be light," could reveal the moment light first broke into the darkness. The one who formed Adam from the dust could reveal what happened in Eden. The one who shut the door of Noah's ark could reveal the story of the flood. The one who called Abraham from Ur could reveal the promises whispered beneath the stars. This is not impossible within the logic of the Bible. In fact, it fits perfectly with the way God already worked with Moses. When Moses received instructions for the tabernacle, he did not invent them. God showed him a pattern. God gave him measurements, materials, designs, priestly garments, rituals, sacrifice, and holy objects with astonishing precision. Moses was not in heaven when the heavenly pattern was known, but God showed him what he needed to write and build. So why would Genesis be different? If God could reveal the design of the tabernacle, he could reveal the design of the universe. If God could give Moses the law on Mount Sinai, he could give Moses the story of the beginning. Picture Moses in the wilderness, far from the noise of Egypt, far from the palace where he grew up, far from the slave fields where his people had suffered. He is in the desert, surrounded by silence, standing before the presence of God. The same God who appeared in a burning bush now speaks to him as the covenant people are being formed. Israel has been rescued from Egypt, but they do not yet know who they are. They know they were slaves. They know Pharaoh oppressed them. They know the Red Sea opened, but they need to know something deeper. They need to know where the world came from. They need to know why humanity is broken. They need to know why sin entered the human story. They need to know why God chose Abraham, why Israel exists, and why their suffering in Egypt was not the end of the story. Genesis gives them that foundation. It tells a nation of former slaves, your story did not begin with Pharaoh. Your story began with God. That is powerful. Pharaoh may have claimed ownership over their bodies, but Genesis reminded them that God created their souls. Egypt may have called them slaves, but Genesis told them they were made in the image of God. And Moses, the man chosen to lead them out of bondage, was also the man chosen to write down the story that gave meaning to their freedom. Direct revelation explains what human memory alone could never fully explain. It explains how Moses could write about the first light before any human eyes existed to see it. It explains how he could describe the garden, the fall, the flood, and the private dealings of God with the patriarchs. But revelation does not mean God ignored history. It does not mean Moses sat in a trance and wrote words disconnected from the lives of real people. In the Bible, revelation often comes into history, confirms history, purifies history, and gives history its true meaning. God could reveal what no one saw, and he could also guide Moses in preserving what generations had remembered. And that leads us to the second answer. Because Genesis may not have come to Moses only from heaven above. It may also have reached him through a chain of memory stretching all the way back to the first man. The second answer begins with something modern people often underestimate: memory. We live in a world where we forget phone numbers because our devices remember them for us. We forget birthdays unless a calendar reminds us. We search for facts in seconds. And because of that, we assume ancient people must have had weaker knowledge than we do. But in many ways, the opposite was true. Ancient people lived in a world where memory was not a convenience. Memory was survival. Before every family had written books, before every village had libraries, before history could be copied and stored easily, the most important truths were carried in the mind, repeated by the mouth, and guarded by the community. This is where the mystery of Genesis becomes even deeper, because the stories Moses wrote may have come through a sacred chain of memory, stretching across generations. Genesis itself gives us a clue most people rush past: the incredible lifespans of the earliest patriarchs. Adam lived 930 years. Methuselah lived 969 years. Noah lived 950 years. Shem, the son of Noah, lived 600 years. To modern ears, those numbers sound almost impossible to imagine, but inside the world of Genesis, those long lives create something extraordinary. They create a bridge. They mean the story of the beginning did not have to pass through thousands of unknown voices. It could have passed through only a few. Think about this carefully. According to the genealogies in Genesis, Methuselah was born while Adam was still alive. That means Methuselah could have heard directly from Adam about the garden, about the creation of Eve, about the command of God, about the serpent, about the foe, about the day everything changed. Methuselah then lived close to the time of Noah and the flood. Noah's son Shem survived the flood and lived long enough to reach the age of the patriarchs. According to the biblical timeline, Shem could have still been alive during the lifetime of Abraham. That means Abraham, the father of Israel's faith, may have had access to a man who personally stepped out of the ark into a washed and broken world. And Abraham's story passed to Isaac. Isaac's story passed to Jacob. Jacob's sons carried the family into Egypt. Levi's line led to Kohath, Kohath to Amram, and Amram was the father of Moses. When you see the chain that way, the distance between Adam and Moses suddenly feels different. It is still thousands of years, but it is not an empty gap. It is a guarded river of memory. Adam could speak to Methuselah. Methuselah could preserve the memory into the world of Noah. Shem could carry the memory beyond the flood. Abraham could receive the ancient story. And from Abraham it could flow through the covenant family until it reached the ears of Moses. This is not the childish game of telephone that critics often imagine. This was not a group of people casually changing stories around a fire for entertainment. In ancienne culture, especially in covenant communities, sacred history was repeated with care. Genealogies were memorized. Family stories were rehearsed. Blessings, promises, warnings, and covenants were passed down because they explained identity. A father would not say to his son, Here is a fun legend from long ago. He would say, "This is who we are. This is where we came from. This is what God promised our fathers." And when a story defines who you are, you do not treat it carelessly. You guard it. You correct it. You repeat it. You teach it to your children until it becomes part of their bones. Imagine a Hebrew child in Egypt, born into slavery, hearing the stories of Abraham at night. His hands may belong to Pharaoh's labor, but his heart belongs to the promise of God. He hears that his people were not always slaves. He hears that their ancestor Abraham was called by God. He hears that God promised a land to a nation and a blessing. He hears about Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. He hears that Joseph once ruled in Egypt, and that before Joseph died, he said God would surely visit his people and bring them out. Those stories were not entertainment. They were hope. Pharaoh could control their work, their movement, even their children. But he could not erase the memory of God's promise. And Moses grew up at the crossing point of those two worlds. He was raised in Pharaoh's court, but he was born from Hebrew blood. Before the palace shaped his education, the Hebrew story had already marked his identity. The memories of the fathers, the promise to Abraham, the suffering in Egypt, the hope of deliverance, all of it surrounded him. So when Moses later wrote Genesis, he may not have been inventing the past. He may have been writing down the sacred memory his people had carried for centuries. But memory alone still does not explain everything. It explains family stories, names, promises, and genealogies. It explains why Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph could be remembered with such depth. Yet Genesis has a structure that suggests something even more fascinating. Maybe Moses did not only receive oral tradition. Maybe he also inherited ancient records, documents older than the Exodus itself, hidden inside the very design of Genesis. But to understand how Genesis could have survived until Moses, we have to enter the world of the Hebrews in Egypt. For more than 400 years, they lived under the shadow of a foreign empire. They built cities they did not own. They labored under masters who did not pity them. Their sons were threatened. Their freedom was stolen. And their future seemed buried beneath the weight of Pharaoh's command. But there was one thing Egypt could not take from them: their memory. The Hebrews did not survive only because they had strong bodies. They survived because they had a story. They knew they were not born from slavery. They knew their beginning was not in the brick fields of Egypt, but in the promise God gave to Abraham. Somewhere in the darkness of slave houses, fathers whispered to sons, mothers taught daughters, elders gathered the young and repeated the names that Pharaoh wanted them to forget: Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph. These names were not just family history. They were proof that God had spoken before Egypt ever ruled over them. Imagine a Hebrew mother holding her child at night while outside. Egyptian guards walk past in the darkness. She tells him, "You are not what Pharaoh calls you. You are a child of the promise." God called Abraham from a far country. God gave Isaac by a miracle. God wrestled with Jacob and gave him a new name. God raised Joseph from a prison to a palace. And one day, God will visit us too. That kind of memory is not easily destroyed. In ancient Israel, remembering was not passive. It was not simply thinking about the past. It was an act of faith. To remember was to resist. To remember was to declare that the present suffering was not the final truth. The Egyptians had monuments of stone, but the Hebrews had monuments of speech. They had genealogies, blessings, songs, covenant promises, and stories repeated again and again until they became the soul of a people. This is why the book of Genesis is filled with names. Modern readers often rush past genealogies. But to the Hebrews, those names were lifelines. Every name said, "We were known before we were enslaved. We belonged to God before we belonged to Pharaoh." And this explains why oral tradition in the Hebrew world was treated with such seriousness. The stories of the fathers were not entertainment. They were identity. A people without land, without a king, and without political power still had something no empire could erase: the memory of God's promise. The elders guarded that memory. Families repeated it. Children absorbed it. The story of Joseph must have been especially powerful in Egypt, because Joseph was the proof that God could work even inside the very empire that later enslaved them. Joseph had been betrayed by his brothers, sold as a slave, falsely accused, forgotten in prison, and yet God raised him to power. For Hebrew slaves, that story was more than history. It was hope. If God could bring Joseph from the pit to the palace, then maybe he could bring Israel from bondage to freedom. Moses was born into that world of remembered promise. Yes, he was raised in Pharaoh's palace. Yes, he received the education of Egypt, but before he became a prince of Egypt, he was a son of the Hebrews. His mother nursed him. His earliest identity was not Egyptian, but covenantal. He heard, whether in whispers or in sacred instruction, that his people had a God, a promise, and a destiny. That means when Moses later stood before the burning bush, he was not meeting a stranger. He was meeting the God of the stories his people had carried for generations. God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Those names already meant something. They were not empty titles. They were the living memory of a suffering nation. And when Moses eventually wrote Genesis, he was not merely recording ancient information. He was giving written form to the sacred memory that had kept Israel alive. Genesis told the slaves who they were. It told them that their God was not a local tribal deity trapped in Egypt. He was the creator of heaven and earth. It told them that human cruelty did not begin with Pharaoh, but with sin in the human heart. It told them that judgment had come before, mercy had come before, covenant had come before, and deliverance had come before. Every story in Genesis became a mirror for Israel's own life. Adam explained the brokenness of the world. Noah explained judgment and rescue. Abraham explained faith. Jacob explained struggle. Joseph explained suffering turned into salvation. So by the time Moses wrote, Genesis was not a dead record from a forgotten past. It was the heartbeat of the Hebrew people. It had been carried through tears, slavery, childbirth, funerals, prayers, and whispered hope. It had survived because the people needed it to survive. And yet, there is still another layer to the mystery. Because Genesis does not only feel remembered, it feels organized. It has structure, section, repeated formulas, and ancient markers that seem to divide the book into records. And hidden inside those markers may be one of the most fascinating clues in the entire mystery of how Moses wrote what no man witnessed. The third answer is the one hidden inside the structure of Genesis itself. And it begins with a Hebrew phrase most readers pass over without realizing how important it may be. That phrase is Ela Toledot, usually translated as "these are the generations of," or "this is the account of." It appears again and again throughout Genesis, almost like a repeated doorway. Genesis says, "These are the generations of the heavens and the earth." Then later, "This is the book of the generations of Adam." Then, "These are the generations of Noah." Then the sons of Noah. Then Shem. Then Terah. Then Isaac. Then Jacob. At first, it may look like a simple heading, a way of introducing a new section. But some scholars have noticed something fascinating. In the ancient Near East, especially in Mesopotamia, written records on clay tablets often ended with a closing statement called a colophon. A colophon could identify the owner, writer, source, or subject of the tablet. In other words, it was not always a title at the beginning. Sometimes it was a signature at the end. And that raises a powerful possibility. What if the Toledot statements in Genesis are not only introducing what comes next, but preserving the memory of ancient records that came before? What if Moses inherited older family documents, genealogical tablets, Records, and ancestral accounts, then brought them together under the guidance of God? This would mean Moses was not merely sitting alone, trying to imagine the ancient past. He may have been acting as a prophet, historian, and inspired editor, gathering the records of the fathers and arranging them into the book we now call Genesis. Think about how powerful that is. The phrase "the generations of Adam" may point to a record connected with Adam's line. The generations of Noah may point to a preserved account of Noah and the flood. The generations of Shem may point to the line through which the covenant promise would continue. The generations of Terah leads us into the story of Abraham. The generations of Jacob leads us toward Joseph and Egypt. Genesis is not chaotic. It is built with design. It moves from creation to humanity, from humanity to one family, from one family to one covenant line, from that covenant line to the formation of Israel. The structure itself feels like an archive being opened section by section, and this fits the world Moses came from. Abraham came from Ur of the Chaldeans, a place connected to advanced writing, record-keeping, trade, and law. Egypt, where Moses was educated, was also a civilization obsessed with records, genealogies, royal history, and sacred texts. Moses was not an untrained wanderer, scratching random memories into the sand. He was educated in one of the most powerful civilizations on earth, born from a people who guarded their sacred memory, and called by a God who spoke to him directly. If anyone in Israel's early history was capable of preserving ancient records, interpreting them, and arranging them into a unified theological history, it was Moses. But here is the key. This theory does not remove divine inspiration. It actually makes the picture richer. God could have revealed what no human being could know, such as the creation of the world. God could have preserved ancient memories through the patriarchs, and God could have guided Moses as he brought older records into one sacred book, Revelation. Memory and written records do not have to fight each other. They can work together. Genesis may be the result of all three: what God revealed, what the fathers remembered, and what Moses faithfully wrote under divine guidance. That is why Genesis feels both ancient and unified. It carries the weight of memory, the structure of records, and the voice of revelation. And once you see that, the question changes. We are no longer asking, how could Moses possibly know? We are asking, what kind of providence preserved this story from the beginning, until the moment Moses was ready to write it? But of course, not everyone accepts that answer. Modern critics have offered another explanation, one that challenges the traditional view of Moses and Genesis. And to understand the mystery fully, we have to face that challenge honestly. Now, if we are going to deal honestly with the mystery of Genesis, we cannot ignore the challenge raised by modern critics. Many scholars have argued that Moses did not write Genesis at all. They claim the book came much later, after Israel had already become a nation, after kings had ruled, after priests and scribes had shaped Israel's religious identity. This theory is often called the documentary hypothesis, or the JP theory. According to this idea, Genesis and the rest of the Pentateuch were not written by one man, but compiled from several different sources. One source supposedly preferred the divine name Yahweh, another used Elohim, another focused on priestly concerns, another shaped the laws and sermon. Later editors, the theory says, stitched these sources together into the book we now read. At first, that can sound convincing, especially when critics point to repeated stories, different names for God, and shifts in style. They say, look, Genesis uses Elohim in one place and Yahweh in another. That must mean different authors. They say, look, Abraham says Sarah is his sister more than once. That must mean duplicate traditions were combined. They say, look, the flood story has repeated details. That must mean two versions were merged. But the problem is this: what modern critics call evidence of contradiction may actually be evidence of ancient literary design. In Hebrew thought, names matter. A different name for God is not a mistake. It can reveal a different aspect of his character. Elohim often emphasizes God's majesty, power, and authority as creator. Yahweh emphasizes his personal covenant relationship, his nearness, his faithfulness to his people. A writer could use both names deliberately, depending on what he wanted the reader to see. When Genesis says, God created the heavens and the earth, Elohim is fitting because the emphasis is cosmic power. When Genesis moves into the personal relationship between God and humanity, Yahweh appears because the focus becomes covenant, intimacy, and moral responsibility. That is not confusion, that is theology. The same is true with repetition. Modern readers often think repetition means error. But ancient Hebrew literature used repetition as a tool. It slowed the reader down. It emphasized important moments. It allowed the same event or theme to be viewed from another angle. The Psalms do this constantly. Proverbs does this. The prophets do this. A line is repeated with variation, not because the writer forgot what he said, but because the repetition deepens the meaning. Genesis often works the same way. It circles back. It repeats patterns. Brothers struggle. Barrenness becomes a crisis. Younger sons are chosen over older sons. Exile turns into blessing. Human evil is met by divine mercy. These are not random seams from careless editors. They are patterns woven through the entire book. And there is another important point. Moses was exactly the kind of person who could use different styles, sources, names, and records without losing unity. A modern author can quote documents, include family records, preserve speeches, and still be the true author of a unified work. Why could Moses not do the same? If he received revelation from God, inherited oral traditions from the Hebrews, and possibly possessed ancient records from the patriarchal line, then Genesis could contain different voices from history while still being shaped into one inspired book through Moses. That is not weakness. That is richness. The deeper you look, the less Genesis feels like a clumsy patchwork, and the more it feels like a sacred tapestry. Every thread has a place. Creation leads to fall. Fall leads to judgment. Judgment leads to covenant. Covenant leads to Abraham. Abraham leads to Israel. Israel leads to the promise that one day all nations will be blessed. And that unified movement is difficult to explain if Genesis is nothing more than a late religious collage. So yes, critics raise serious questions, and we should not be afraid of them. But serious questions do not automatically destroy faith. Sometimes they force us to look more carefully, and when we look carefully, we see that Genesis is not fragile. It has structure, it has depth, it has theological precision, it has ancient memory. It has the mark of someone who understood both human history and divine purpose. The real question is not whether Genesis has complexity, Of course it does. The real question is whether that complexity points to confusion or to design, and if Moses was educated, prepared, called, and guided by God, then he was not just capable of writing Genesis, he was the perfect man for the task. Moses was the perfect man to write Genesis because his life stood at the intersection of everything Genesis required. He was Hebrew by blood, Egyptian by education, a shepherd by exile, and a prophet by calling. No other man in Israel's early history carried those worlds inside him at the same time. If Genesis needed someone who understood the pain of the Hebrews, Moses understood it. He had seen his people crushed under forced labor. He had heard the cries of slaves rising from the brick fields of Egypt. He knew what it meant for a nation to lose its freedom, its dignity, and almost its memory. But if Genesis also needed someone trained to write, preserve, organize, and communicate history, Moses had that too. He was raised in Pharaoh's palace, surrounded by one of the most powerful civilizations the ancient world had ever known. Egypt was a land of scribes, records, monuments, genealogies, royal archives, sacred texts, legal documents, and historical memory carved into stone. Moses grew up where writing mattered. He grew up where names, dates, dynasties, laws, and victories were preserved with great seriousness. The book of Acts says Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians, and that one sentence explains more than most people realize. Moses was not an untrained desert wanderer, suddenly trying to write the beginning of the world. He had been formed in the intellectual center of an empire. He knew how records worked. He knew the power of written words. He knew how a people preserved identity through history. But Egypt alone did not make Moses ready. In fact, Egypt could teach him how to write, but it could not teach him the meaning of Genesis. For that, Moses had to be separated from the palace. He had to lose the comfort of royalty. He had to flee into the wilderness of Midian, where the noise of Egypt faded and the silence of God began. For 40 years, Moses lived as a shepherd. He walked through desert paths. He learned hunger, loneliness, humility, patience, and hiddenness. He learned the land not from maps, but from dust beneath his feet. He learned what it meant to be forgotten by men before he was remembered by God. And maybe that was necessary, because no man can write Genesis correctly if he still believes human empires are the center of history. Moses had to learn that Pharaoh was not the beginning. Egypt was not the beginning. Kings were not the beginning. God was the beginning. Then came the burning bush. In that moment, Moses did not merely receive a mission. He received the revelation of the God behind the stories of his people. God said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." Those names connected Moses to everything Genesis had been preserving. Abraham was not a legend. Isaac was not a distant memory. Jacob was not a forgotten ancestor. Their God was alive, speaking from the fire, calling Moses to finish what he had promised centuries before. That is what makes Moses so unique. He had the education to write, the heritage to understand, the suffering to feel, the humility to listen, and the divine encounter to obey. Genesis was not written by a man sitting safely above the story. It was written by a man whose life had been shaped by the same God who shaped the lives of the patriarchs. Moses knew what it meant to be spared from death as a baby. Like the chosen line, had been preserved again and again. He knew what it meant to live as a stranger between worlds. Like Abraham leaving Ur, like Jacob fleeing home, like Joseph living in Egypt. He knew what it meant for God to turn exile into preparation. Joseph went from the pit to the palace. Moses went from the palace to the wilderness. Both discovered that God does some of his greatest work in places that look like ending. And during the 40 years after the Exodus, Moses had what no Egyptian scribe, no Hebrew elder, and no modern critic could ever claim: direct access to the presence of God. In the wilderness, Israel was being formed as a nation, and Moses stood between God and the people. He received law, instruction, judgment, covenant, worship, and identity. There, in the desert, Genesis made perfect sense. Israel needed to know that the God who delivered them from Egypt was not merely stronger than Pharaoh. He was the creator of the heavens and the earth. They needed to know that sin did not begin in Egypt, but in Eden. They needed to know that judgment did not begin with the plagues, but with a world corrupted by violence. They needed to know that mercy did not begin at the Red Sea, but when God covered Adam and Eve, preserved Noah, called Abraham, protected Isaac, wrestled with Jacob, and lifted Joseph out of prison. Moses wrote Genesis as a man prepared by providence. Every chapter of his life had trained him for this task. The Nile taught him he had been rescued. The palace taught him wisdom. The wilderness taught him humility. The burning bush taught him obedience. Sinai taught him holiness. And the presence of God taught him the beginning. So when we ask, how could Moses write what no man witnessed, we must also ask, who else was better prepared? Who else carried the memory of the Hebrews, the education of Egypt, the discipline of the desert, and the voice of God? Moses was not a random author, placed at the beginning of Israel's story. He was the man God had been preparing from the moment he was placed in a basket on the Nile. His whole life was a manuscript before he ever wrote a word. And that is why Genesis feels the way it does. It is not cold history. It is not distant mythology. It is the beginning of the world, written through the hand of a man who had learned that God rules over beginnings, endings, exile, suffering, nation, and promises. Moses could write Genesis because God had written preparation into Moses long before Moses ever picked up the pen. Now, after all of this, someone might ask, why does this really matter? Why should it matter to your life today, whether Moses received Genesis through revelation, sacred memory, ancien record, or all of them together? The answer is simple, but it is not small, because the way you understand Genesis changes the way you understand everything that comes after it. If Genesis is only a collection of ancient myths, then creation is just a symbol. Eden is just a story. The fall is just an idea. Noah is just a legend. Abraham is just a tribal memory. And Joseph is just an inspiring tale about survival. But if Genesis is what Scripture presents it to be, a sacred record preserved by God, shaped through real history, and written under divine guidance, then every detail matters. The creation matters because it tells you that your life is not an accident. You were not born from chaos without meaning. You were made by a God who creates with purpose, order, and intention. The Garden of Eden matters because it explains the ache inside the human heart. That strange feeling that the world is beautiful but broken, that we were made for something higher but have fallen far from it. The fall matters because it tells the truth about sin. Sin is not just bad behavior. It is separation from God. It is distrust. It is the human desire to take control, to decide good and evil without the Creator. And once you see that in Adam and Eve, you begin to see it in yourself. Noah matters because he shows what faith looks like when the whole world laughs at obedience. Imagine building an ark under a clear sky, while everyone around you thinks you are insane. Imagine trusting the Word of God when there is no visible proof yet. That is not just Noah's story. That is the story of every person who chooses righteousness in a world that rewards compromise. Abraham matters because he teaches what it means to leave what is familiar and follow God into the unknown. God did not give Abraham a full map. He gave him a promise. And for many of us, that is exactly how faith works. God does not always show the whole road. Sometimes He gives only enough light for the next step. Jacob matters because he shows that God can work with a broken, struggling, complicated person. Jacob was not perfect. He deceived. He He wrestled. He feared. But God met him in the night and gave him a new name. That means your past does not have the final word if God has not finished with you. Joseph matters because his life answers one of the deepest questions human beings ever ask. Can God bring good out of betrayal? Joseph was hated by his brothers. Sold as a slave, falsely accused, forgotten in prison, and buried under years of pain he did not deserve. But the same God who seemed silent was arranging every step. When Joseph finally stood before the brothers who had destroyed his youth, he said one of the most powerful lines in all of Scripture. You meant evil against me, but God meant it for good. That is not just history. That is hope. It means God does not waste suffering when a life is surrendered to Him. And Moses, the man who wrote that story down, understood it personally. He knew what it meant to lose a palace, to run into exile, to spend 40 years in obscurity, wondering if his life had failed. But the wilderness was not the end of Moses. It was preparation. The silence was not abandonment. It was formation. The delay was not denial. It was God shaping the man who would one day lead a nation and write the book of beginnings. That is why Genesis matters. It does not simply tell us how the world began. It tells us how God works. He creates light out of darkness. He brings order out of chaos. He covers shame. He judges evil. He preserves a remnant. He calls ordinary people into impossible promises. He turns barren places into beginnings. He turns betrayal into rescue. He turns exile into preparation. And if He did it then, He can still do it now. Maybe you are in a season that feels like Egypt, trapped under pressure you did not choose. Maybe you are in a wilderness like Moses, wondering if the best years of your life are behind you. Maybe you are in a pit like Joseph, betrayed by people who should have protected you. Maybe you are waiting like Abraham, holding on to a promise that seems impossible. Genesis speaks to all of those places. It says God was there at the beginning, and He is not absent from your story now. Moses wrote Genesis, so Israel would know who they were after slavery. But Genesis still speaks today because people are still trying to remember who they are. You are not defined by Pharaoh, by failure, by betrayal, by delay, or by the wilderness. You are defined by the God who created you, called you, and is still writing redemption into human history. That is why the mystery of Genesis is not only a question about the past, it is an invitation to trust the God who holds the beginning, the middle, and the end. And now we come to the final and most important part of the mystery, because Genesis does not end with Genesis. It points forward. It opens a road that runs through the entire Bible, and that road leads to Jesus Christ. Many people read Genesis as if it is only about the beginning of the world, the beginning of humanity, or the beginning of Israel. But Jesus read Genesis as something more. After His resurrection, when He walked with the disciples on the road to Emmaus, Scripture says that beginning with Moses and all the prophets, He explained to them the things concerning Himself. Beginning with Moses, that means Jesus saw the writings of Moses not as disconnected ancient stories, but as the foundation of the gospel. In another place, Jesus told the religious leaders, "If you believed Moses, you would believe me, for he wrote about me." That statement is breathtaking. Jesus was saying that Moses did not merely write about creation, law, ancestors, and history. Moses wrote in a way that pointed toward the Messiah. So, when Moses wrote Genesis, he was not only preserving the beginning of the world, he was preserving the beginning of redemption. Think about it. In Genesis, humanity falls into sin. But God gives the first promise that the seed of the woman will crush the serpent's head. That is the first shadow of Christ. In Genesis, God covers Adam and Eve after their shame, pointing toward the covering of grace. In Genesis, Noah passes through judgment in the ark, pointing toward salvation. In Genesis, Abraham is promised that through his seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. That promise does not stop with Israel. It reaches all the way to Jesus. In Genesis, Isaac is laid on the altar by his father. And yet God provides a substitute. In Genesis, Joseph is rejected by his brothers, suffers unjustly, descends into humiliation, and then rises to save the very people who betrayed him. These are not random stories. They are patterns. They are echoes. They are signs that from the very beginning, God was writing a story larger than anyone could see. And Moses, guided by God, gave that story its first written foundation. This is why the question matters so much. Moses was not a creation, but he knew the Creator. Moses did not stand in Eden, but he stood before the God who planted Eden. Moses did not enter the ark with Noah, but he heard from the God who shut the door. Moses did not walk beside Abraham under the stars, but he was called by the same God who made the promise. Moses did not watch Joseph weep in Egypt, but he served the God who turns betrayal into deliverance. That is why Genesis has survived for thousands of years, not because it is merely ancient, but because it is alive with the purpose of God. It tells us where we came from, why the world is broken, why human beings long for redemption, and why God never abandoned His creation. Without Genesis, we would not understand sin. Without sin, we would not understand the need for salvation. Without Abraham, we would not understand covenant. Without covenant, we would not understand Israel. Without Israel, we would not understand the prophets. Without the prophets, we would not understand the Messiah. And without the Messiah, we would not understand the gospel. Genesis is the first stone in the foundation of everything that follows. And Moses was the man God prepared to place that stone. From the Nile to Pharaoh's palace, from the palace to the wilderness, from the wilderness to the burning bush, from the burning bush to Sinai. Every step of Moses' life was preparation. What looked like delay was training. What looked like exile was formation. What looked like failure was providence. God was shaping the man who would lead Israel out of Egypt and give them the book that told them their story began long before slavery. Their story began with God. And maybe that is the final message for us too. Your story does not begin with your pain. It does not begin with what people did to you. It does not begin with the season that broke you, the wilderness that humbled you, or the Egypt that held you captive. Your story begins with the God who created you, sees you, calls you, and is able to redeem what seems lost. Moses wrote what no man witnessed because God is not limited by human memory. He can reveal what was hidden, preserve what was almost forgotten, and use a prepared servant to speak truth across generation. So the next time someone asks, how did Moses write Genesis? If he was not there, remember the deeper answer. He was not there when the world began, but he walked with the one who was. He did not witness the first light, but he knew the God who commanded it to shine. And if Genesis teaches us anything, it is this: the God who was present at the beginning is still present now. The same God who created light out of darkness can bring light into your darkness. The same God who preserved Noah can preserve you. The same God who called Abraham can call you into something greater. The same God who lifted Joseph from the pit can raise you from the place you thought would bury you. And the same God who prepared Moses in silence can be preparing you even when you do not understand the season you are in. Moses was not at creation, but Genesis was never dependent on Moses being there. It was dependent on God speaking, and when God speaks, the beginning becomes clear, the past finds meaning, and the future becomes filled with hope.